I did a version of this workshop at Faulkner University a few months ago for Bible majors there, and it was interesting. The two sessions they engaged with the most were the ones on sexuality and the ones on artificial intelligence and virtual reality. So it was really actually very encouraging to hear some of their thoughts. But we're going to wrap up our sessions today talking about conversations. And I think it would be a disservice for us to examine this kind of material without actually taking time to talk about how do we communicate with emerging generations. So regardless of your age or life stage, whether you have children or grandchildren or no children or know someone else's grandchildren, I think that I hope that this will be beneficial to you. I want to talk about a few different ways that you can approach conversations about technology. We were just talking a moment ago about how growing up, whether you did or didn't have the talk with your parents, but I think that to refer to it as the talk is kind of the wrong premise to begin with. We're talking about a series of conversations. Our kids have different questions at different stages of life based off of their experience and their understanding of the world. So our job as parents and our job as spiritual mentors in the congregation is to cultivate a relationship of conversation with emerging generations. And I use the term emerging generation because to me it just sounds a little cooler than saying young people, and it also makes me feel less like old people. I was always referred to as the young person growing up, and that somehow just, I don't know, whenever somebody said young people today, I tuned them out. They're emerging generations. They're emerging adults, and they're learning how to become adults and think like adults. And so we want our conversations to model for them and to direct them in how to do that. So just a few ways to kind of approach some of these things. The first one is the idea of permanency. When it comes to long-lasting things, I think it's good to have conversations at a very young age with our children, and there's a really good illustration, I think, that can help us with this. A passage that relates to this idea is, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." Say nice things. There's several passages in Scripture that you could look at to teach your children how to talk. Colossians 3 is another one. To not let obscene talk come out of your mouth. When our kids are very young, again, I mentioned before, I have a 9, 7, 5, and almost 2-year-old. We talk about our words a lot in our family. Don't say mean things. Don't be mean. Don't be a punk, man. You know, it's what you say matters. The old saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," is just wrong. It rhymes, but that's about it as far as it goes. So the illustration then, and you've likely come across this, it's nothing super novel, but to me it's very impactful. You can do this for teenagers all the way down to young people. In fact, I had a group of teenagers I was talking to a couple of weeks ago at a church over in Florence, and I had a younger girl, like a 6th grader, and then a big burly 12th grade or junior baseball player guy. And I had them both stand there. We didn't do it with toothpaste because we didn't have it. We had ketchup and mustard bottles. And I gave them 10 seconds to squirt out as much as they possibly could onto a plate. And whoever had the most would win that round. And so they go at it, and it's amazing how quickly two teenagers can go competitive. And of course the girls were cheering for the girls, and the guy for the guy, like, dude, you can't lose to a girl. But he did. So we stopped and we looked, and that's a lot. All right, now you got 10 more seconds, and you got to put it all back in the tube. Ready, go. Before they even have a chance to kind of process that, they're like, of course, when you got an audience, you're more intimidated and scared, and they eventually try for 10 seconds, and you can't. If you squirt toothpaste out of the tube, you can't really get it back in there. And that's the way it is with our words. When you say something hurtful and mean to someone, it's out there. You can apologize, and you can try to reconcile, but the truth is the impact is still kind of there. I read somewhere that one negative comment, it takes like 6 or 7 positive affirmations to equal the impact of the negative. And that's a big stat for us to understand as adults, as parents, but also just as Christians. The old adage, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. Jesus tells us to use speech that builds each other up. In the digital age in particular, once you post something, even if you take it down, it's still out there. It's still accessible. Snapchat created its empire with this idea that nothing is permanent, that you can post and within a matter of seconds that post is going to go away. Because they were successful with that, Instagram and Facebook then started adding stories. Because stories you post and for 24 hours they're up there, and after 24 hours they disappear. But there's always a digital footprint somewhere. So when your children are young, giving them this illustration to then go back to over and over again at each stage of development, I think is a really healthy way for them to understand that things in the digital landscape are actually permanent, even if you think they're gone. Reference the fightthenewdrug.org. I was listening to an interview they had on their podcast. It was a young lady that had been human trafficked, and had a video. She thought she was going to like an interview for exercise equipment and apparel, and it ended up being something very different. Well, she was successful in getting her videos taken off of 3 or 4 of the major platforms. But with the internet, with an image or with a video, there's the option to download or to screenshot. And so because you took it away from a platform gives you some measure of comfort, but the reality is there's an innumerable amount of access. You have no idea really where it's whack-a-mole forever. And so if a young lady then is asked to send a picture of her body to a young man, I promise I'm not going to show it to anybody. Well, you send it, but then you unsend it. All it takes is just clicks of 2 buttons, and now it's a screenshot. And you got it, and it goes wherever, and it's no longer in your control. You cannot put the toothpaste back in the tube. It's a really simple but very easy way to communicate this idea of permanency. And the reason it takes wisdom to navigate having social media is the same reason it takes wisdom to navigate the wheel of a car. And that's another way that I would approach. We'll get to that approach here in just a moment. This is Sarah Michelle Gellar and Freddie Prinze Jr. They were the Kelly Kapowski and Zach Morris of the early 2000s. They were both young actress, and they were in several movies. They, in real life, actually became husband and wife, and they had a couple of kids together. Sarah Michelle Gellar, in the last couple of years, has been interviewed, asked about social media. These are people who have made their success in life through the entertainment industry. And they asked, do your kids have social media? She said, no, I won't let them. In fact, when they asked me about having social media, she used a great illustration. She said, giving you access at this age to social media, or even to, I think maybe it was to a mobile device, is a little bit like you asking me to get a Paw Patrol face tattoo. Now, when you're 3 and 4, Paw Patrol face tattoo sounds like the best idea ever. But in a little short amount of time, 6 months to 6 years, walking into elementary school with a Paw Patrol face tattoo, just in general, face tattoos outside of Mike Tyson, it's a horrible idea, right? She to me, that was a great way to explain that when you're 10 years old, having a face tattoo, it's not as cool anymore. So if you're talking to an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old, take whatever it was that was their favorite cartoon, to get a Bluey tattoo, which, I love Bluey, so maybe that one's a bad illustration, but find something that was young and immature, or that was once something they loved, but now that they're older is immature, and say, what if you permanently put that on your face? The idea of permanency is something that we really have to put a lot of effort and energy into teaching these emerging generations, because they live in a time where permanency is not, it's different, it's skewed a bit. Their understanding of that is very, very different. But the sticks and stones do hurt, and so do words. And sometimes the emotional scars, they heal long after the physical scars of an injury. Well, how do you explain that to a 5 and 6-year-old? I think using the toothpaste illustration as they get older, using something along these lines. And again, this is not from a spiritual interview. This was just an interview she gave to, I forget what news outlet, but I thought it was pretty good. There's a group called Wait Until 8th. They're a good follow on Instagram. If you're on Instagram, they post information like this often of different celebrities and the ways they have approached social media with their children. It's a good place to find some of that information. So the driver's license approach to social media, to me, is one of the best ways for me to wrap my brain around how do I approach this, because it does seem like just a massive thing. How do we begin talking to our kids about these things? Well, when I was growing up, getting a car was the symbol of freedom, to get your driver's license to be able to drive a car. Where I lived in Montgomery, I lived at the top of a hill, and if you didn't make the turn, you crashed in our front yard, which happened fairly often. But if you tripped and rolled down the hill, you would land in the parking lot of the grocery store. You didn't have to walk. But when I turned 16 and Mom needed a loaf of bread, better believe I got my keys, I got in my car, and basically put it in neutral and rolled down to the parking lot. Because in my mind, going to the grocery store, 200 yards away was the equivalent of crossing the border into Mexico. There was freedom, there was excitement and adventure. What's interesting is that emerging generations don't have that same view of it because they've been so connected online for so long. The tangible freedom of a vehicle is not exciting to them. And so there's a delay, a pretty significant delay in kids getting their license today. 16 is not a rite of passage like it once was. But in order for kids to drive, what do they have to do? They have to take a test. And what is that test based off of? Literature, laws, right? They have a manual, so they have to read and study a manual. They have to show competency of that information because these are the laws through which we are all agreeing to drive by. And then they have to spend time behind the wheel with someone that is wiser, someone that is an experienced driver, someone that can coach them and mentor them. And they have incremental freedom before they ever get a chance to drive on their own. And as a parent, if my child turns 16 and they've technically read the manual and they've aced the test, and they've taken time behind the wheel, but I still don't feel like they are in a place where they're going to make good decisions being solo, that I won't give them the keys by themselves. I think that's a decent approach to social media and just technology in general. I've already started, we had a perfect example of this a couple of weeks ago. My daughter got my wife's phone without permission, and my oldest son was just being silly. He was just doing the wiggles or something, and my daughter was able to navigate to the video, took a video, and then sent a text message to me, my in-laws, my wife, and I think their aunt, a group message. And I got it, and I said, Ellen, why in the world did you send this to this random group of people? She said, I don't have my phone. And I'll be honest, in that moment, this is the first time we've really had something like this happen. Like I was very upset. By the time I got downstairs, I was in a much better place of, okay, you got to put into practice everything you've been studying here. Like, hey guys, did you just send a text message? And they immediately of course my son, she did it, kind of the old Adam approach of the woman did it. And my daughter, you just have to look at her and she confesses and melts. It's very innocent and very, very good. And I tried not to throw extra shame on there. But in that moment, I said, let me see the phone. Did you ask permission for the phone? No. What did you do? Tell me exactly what you did. And so she told me. I said, things like this, you did it without permission. And what you did was not evil. I don't think you had evil intention. I want you to understand that. But these are the kinds of things that will prevent me from allowing you to have a cell phone or a tablet on your own for a while. And this is the reason why you're going to be one of the last of your friend group to get these things, because you didn't have permission. And so what you did was unwise. And as you start to show a pattern of wisdom, and my daughter is an excellent child. She's very good. She wants to follow the rules. My boys are a very different part of creation right now. But she wants to do right. And I want to make sure that I don't crush that part of her and develop, a desire to rebel. But I also want her to understand, because she understands differently than my 7-year-old son. He was just, looking at the wall or whatever. She was eye contact. She was listening. So I feel like this is a pivotal moment of, these are the kinds of things that I need to see a pattern of behavior, of wisdom, before I allow you then to have the freedom to take something like this on your own. So in those moments, you talk a lot about it, parenting conversation. We talk about teachable moments. We have a lot of those. What are the things that we want our children to develop as they get older? We want them to be honest, right? We want them to develop wisdom to be able to make good decisions. We want them to be kind. We want them to help people. There are all of these intangible attributes that we want for our kids. We don't just want them to be successful on the ball field or in the classroom, but we want what character traits. I would encourage you to spend time thinking about what character traits do you want your kids to have as an adult. What makes a faithful, godly Christian as an adult? What are those characteristics that I need to begin instilling very specifically in my children? I need to highlight in them, because those are the things that are going to give them the skills to navigate social media well. Every now and then in our neighborhood, I'll let one of my kids hop in our lap and they'll steer. They think they're driving, but they're not really driving. They can't reach the pedals. They're just kind of doing this number. And every time if they look away, I said, you got to keep your eyes on the road. I'm going to do that probably 1,000,000 times before they ever get behind the wheel of a car themselves. Why would social media be any different? How old did your child need to be before you're comfortable dropping them off in downtown New York City or downtown Beijing, downtown Rio de Janeiro, Las Vegas, pick a major city. Because when we give them access to the internet, not just social media, but to the internet, unsupervised, we're basically saying, here you are on downtown Times Square, make your way back home by dinner, and be well-adjusted and mature, right? That's what we do when we give them free access. So we have to think in terms of what is the end goal that we want and work our way back. How do we instill those things? How can we take moments, little moments here, and start really impressing upon them the spiritual truths and character that we want them to have? I think the driver's license approach is good. It's incremental. I would force them to read literature. There's nothing that says you don't have to. The artist Pink, you may be familiar with her. She was real popular in the early 2000s as well. She was on a radio talk show a while back, and she was talking about the same thing with her kids. She said, my daughter, she's going to be a lawyer one day. She's excellent at arguing. But she keeps asking me about being on social. She said, when you show me academic literature that says that it's beneficial for you, then we'll talk about you getting a social media account. I don't think that's unreasonable. She said, it may come out at some point, but right now, all of the literature that I'm seeing says that it's harmful. So walk them through that. Go through that book list. There's a book called Screens and Teens, and have them read that. Some of these books that are written for adults have good information for children to also take a look at. There's one called Raising Good Digital Humans. It's on that list as well. Is another one that seems to be, I haven't finished, I have it, but I haven't read it yet. But find books for them to read, have them read it, and then talk about it. Glow Kids is a really powerful book that I would encourage parents to read. It may not necessarily, I don't know, there's some, you could have them read chapters in there. But why would we not do that? Why would we think we have them read the Bible because we want them to learn it. They have to read the manual to drive the car. So I think that's a good expectation that we can start early and often. Talking about screen time, that's a big thing. I was talking with a gentleman earlier about specifically when you can be on your phone and you look up and it's been 3 hours. You've been sucked into the rabbit hole of YouTube or Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is, right? And you look up and you've wasted part of your day. It's impacted the workforce. So how do we talk to our kids about that? I found a really good illustration online. This came from a YouTube video, but from a guy in a TED Talk, and that's on that YouTube playlist. So these dots represent roughly a 90-year life expectancy, which is the expectancy we have in our country now. One row equals 3 years of life, roughly. And he broke it down like this. He said the top section of purple there represents 288 months that you were going to spend sleeping. I think mine may be less than that at this point. But work and school combined for about 126 months of life. You're going to spend 18 months doing nothing but driving. You're going to spend 36 months cooking and eating. I think mine would lean more on the eating than the cooking part, but definitely somewhere in that neighborhood. And then about 36 months doing chores and errands, and roughly 27 months in the bathroom for hygiene. I think that and the cooking and the eating part may be directly connected. But now you've got 334 months left of free time. And so taking what the current average screen time is of young people today, those black dots represent the amount of time, if you just went by the average, which again is somewhere like the 6 to 7 hour a day, then this is the amount of time you're going to spend 312 months. That's more than sleep. That's more than work and school. That's so much more than chores, errand driving, cooking, eating. And then you're left with just a little partial row here of actual free time. I showed this chart to our teenagers at Madison, and there was a visceral reaction of, ooh. There was that same reaction when I saw it. When you make it visual, it makes more sense. The fact that we can do a lot of things with our devices is neither good nor bad. The fact that technology is so powerful is something that we have to be keenly, wisely aware of. Because the simple tool of distraction is very useful for Satan's purposes. If you use your phone exclusively as your Bible study apparatus, I would encourage you to reconsider, because there are so many opportunities for fragmented attention spans. If it's the only way you read books, I would encourage you to reconsider. There's just what we're seeing is there's a different cognitive development that occurs when we use things that are tangible and things that only keep our attention and they don't vie for other pieces of attention. Because the phone is not just a phone. It's everything but a fax machine these days, right? It's the internet. It's all of the internet. It's an app, and it's all of the apps. So it's something for us to really consider. And I think this visualization of what an 18-year-old would have left in their life, you ask the question, so how are you choosing to spend your time? How are you planning to utilize the time that God has given us here? And then you follow up with Scripture. James 4:14 says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." On the Sunday after New Year's, so I guess it was maybe New Year's Day this past January, every other week we go to my parents' house after church for lunch, and the other weeks we go to my in-laws. This was the Sunday we were going to my parents. And I was walking into my parents' house. My brother met me at the door, and he had this just odd look on his face, an expression I'd never seen. He said, "Hey, just want to let you know, Mom just got a call. Aunt Lori died." Aunt Lori is the youngest sibling in my mom's family. My mom's mother passed away last August, and my mom was very close with her. She struggled and is still struggling with the grief of that. Aunt Lori was basically my mom's daughter growing up. My mom was the next to oldest, but because of the dynamics in their family, she essentially kind of raised Aunt Lori. They were very closest sibling probably in her family, and the youngest. So it didn't make sense. So my response was there a car accident? He said, we don't really know. Well, come to find out, my aunt and uncle have a home in Roswell, Georgia, and then they have a farm up in North Carolina. And my aunt typically runs the farm. My uncle has a business in Atlanta. And so she had left that night, Roswell, to head to the farm. She said she didn't feel great. Come to find out, she actually did have some underlying health issues that none of us were really fully aware of. She laid down on the couch that night and never woke up. My uncle had been texting, and then she stopped texting and thought, well, she just fell asleep. That happens sometimes. So he called the neighbor the next morning to go and check on her, and they found her on the couch. This verse has hit me very differently since in the last few months. When we talk about permanency and we talk about our lives are not permanent here as they are right now. Teaching that to our children incrementally as they get older, not in a way that scares them, but in a way that encourages them to take advantage of the time we have together, should also encourage us to do the same. What has our attention has our hearts. Our children need our attention. I now have a conversation that as my kids get older, I will point them back to that situation. And I will try to show them that you don't have anything guaranteed in this life. So it's a very sobering conversation, but I think a very important conversation. And I guess this is a question for the room. What is your purpose for technology? What are some of the reasons or purposes that you utilize technology in your world?
I love frustration.
You love what? Frustration? No, that's why you have technology to frustrate you? There you go. You must drive a smart car. Is that what it is? No. Oh, yeah. That's right. I think generally kind of what we started with on this is most of us implement technology when it makes our life more comfortable and more convenient. How much time do we spend articulating to younger generations the purpose of technology? Most likely not often. I know up until I started looking into this stuff, I didn't really do it very often. I didn't think about it. And that's part of the problem, is that we're kind of on autopilot with how we adopt technologies into our life. I think we need to spend time asking the why question a lot. Why do we automate all of the systems in our home? Why do we use this app? Why do we have this piece of technology? Because as your kids come to you and say, hey, I want a phone. Well, why do you want a phone? Well, I want to be able to talk to my friends. Okay, so you want a device that can talk to your friends. Yeah, but I want this app and this app. Well, what does that app do? Well, it does this, this, and this. Well, you said you wanted to talk to your friends on your phone. Perfect example was probably 15 years ago now. So it's a little bit dated. There was a teenager in our youth group that went up to his dad and said, Dad, I need a phone. All my friends have a phone. I want a phone. Can I get a phone? And eventually his dad relented and said, okay, you can have a phone. So he went to school, came home the next day and said, Dad, this isn't going to work. Well, why not? He said, I got to have a camera. Everybody's got a camera in their phone. And his dad looked at him and said, well, do you want a camera or do you want a phone? He said, well, I want both. You can't have both. This is when you could have one without the other. I thought that was a pretty good response. This is what you said you wanted. But this is what you're saying will give you that. But sometimes what it promises, remember, is not what you're after. So getting them to think critically at a young age, if they can answer the question of why, and it's a good answer of substance, then you can begin incrementally granting that wish. But otherwise, what you're actually trying to do is you're teaching them to ask better questions. The older I get, the more I realize becoming a wise Christian doesn't mean that I have the ready reference memorized. It means that I'm actually asking better questions. And that's what we want to try to do when it comes to our kids and their relationship to technology. This should be a little bit alarming to us. In May of last year, the Surgeon General of the United States issued this social media and youth mental health survey, or this advisory. And you can download this off the internet. This is available from the U.S. government. And in it, he recommends the age of 16 be the first contact that young people have with social media. And he cites a lot of the research that we've talked about, a lot of the trends that we're seeing. If the government recognizes this, then how deep do you think the spiritual impact has been? I'll give you an example. The first Surgeon General analysis, not policy, the first Surgeon General advisory that came out about cigarettes and tobacco being harmful and causing cancer and death came out in 1964. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s that we had not just the big labels on products, but we had commercials where someone picked up their little voice box and said, in the morning I get up. That made a profound impact on me as a kid. I remember seeing that. It took 30 years to turn popular opinion against big tobacco. 30 years of really effective marketing continued to kill people. We're closing in on 25, 30 years of social media. And we're just now getting the research that says, hey, people are dying, this is harmful. So if we're waiting on legislation to create the healthy boundaries, we're going to be always at least a generation or more behind. Also, the government doesn't legislate hearts. The government puts in laws according to the overall good of a body of people. So we shouldn't be looking at the government at all. We shouldn't be surprised when the government's regulations fall short. These are our regulations. This is our standard. These are our guidelines. In that survey, pardon me, the Surgeon General says children are exposed to harmful content on social media ranging from violent and sexual content to bullying and harassment. And for too many children, social media use is compromising their sleep and valuable in-person time with family and friends. We're in the middle of a national youth mental health crisis, and I'm concerned that social media is an important driver of that crisis, one we must urgently address. There is a growing number of school systems that are adopting technology policies where phones are put in tech bags and kids can't access them throughout the day. They're given dummy phones. I saw on Jonathan Haidt's Instagram this morning, actually, he posted something of several schools in Europe that have new policies where children sign a contract that between the hours of morning and evening of school, they don't use their technology. I have a friend who's an assistant principal at middle school. Her daughter played softball with my daughter last year. She said they're actively trying to get technology out of the classrooms because it doesn't add any educational benefit. It adds drama, it adds fights, and the things that happen at school fester at home and they come right back to school. They've had more fights and bullying than they've ever had. And she attributes it all directly to the presence of technology in the school system. I don't see any value of having a tech-driven education experience for any child in elementary school. Young people will figure out how to use technology. That's not the problem. The problem is teaching them how to navigate it at a time where they're trying to navigate regular life. It's too much, too soon. Congress failed to meet the moment on social media. This came from a time when the OpenAI, Sam Altman, he's the CEO of OpenAI, which is the company that is behind ChatGPT and a big leader in artificial intelligence. He was testifying before Congress in May of 2023. And I don't know about you, but when a U.S. senator acknowledges wrongdoing publicly, granted it was on like C-SPAN 4 or 5, but still, he said it into a microphone and it was documented. For a U.S. senator to say, we messed up, that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And his point there was with social media, we didn't put guardrails in. It was unregulated. We didn't think about it being a negative thing, and now we see the result of that. We can't make that same mistake with AI, so they were asking Sam Altman to help them with that. That's something that we should take note of. I don't mean to just be an anti-government guy. I'm not. But I don't know of too many politicians that are willfully acknowledging wrongdoing. It doesn't typically work in their favor to stay in that position, right? But this is a big deal. We failed to meet the moment on social media. Yeah. And we're all a part of this group project, whether we signed up knowingly or not. A really good question, I think, to ask your child is, how does this app or how does this device cultivate the fruit of the Spirit? Use the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians as an opportunity for Bible study and for life philosophy, really. That's a great question for all of us. How does this friendship, am I becoming more like Christ? Is there more evidence of the Spirit in my life because of this habit, because of this device, because of this app? Insert whatever it is you need to there. The reason we talk about technology and faith is because technology amplifies what is in our hearts, and our brains are connected directly to our hearts. Jesus said the eye is the lamp of the body. If you fill your eye with light, then your whole body will be filled with light. If you fill your eye with darkness, your whole body will be filled with darkness. I think Psalm 139 says, "Turn my eyes from worthless things." If there was ever a passage written for the age of social media, it's that. We're talking like thousands of years ago. God knew what he was saying. The sins are the same. The access is different. If you're an old member of an older generation, the things that you struggled with as a child, as a teenager, these kids are struggling with as well. They're just kind of amplified a little bit. And there are more voices in their world than you had in yours, for better or worse, and too often it's for worse. Access to excess is not something that typically yields holiness. I had that slide up earlier. That was the last one, yep. So again, going back to the book list and the YouTube playlist for recommended readings and interviews. We've got a couple of more minutes. I know I've done a lot of lecture. It's a lot of information to get through and a lot to absorb in a short period of time. What questions or comments do you all have regarding this or anything that we've talked about?
Maybe you could speak to the question that Sarah/I had asked earlier about kind of merging this with the last session, and as your child is growing up, how do you avoid being in that 50% or 80% that did not have any conversation about this? What does it look like?
Yeah.
If you can statistically expect your child to be exposed to these things at 7,
Yeah.
9, 10, 11, how do you go about that?
So what is a proper approach to talking with your kids specifically about sexual things? The approach that my wife and I have taken, and it was more her to begin with than me, we call things by their names. And so from the very beginning, Ellen has modeled that we're going to call body parts what they are and not necessarily use slang. And at first, that made me a little uncomfortable because I'm a recovering teenage boy, and we had a lot of slang terms for a lot of different things. And I have seen that has proven to be a very good thing, I think. Right now, what we say oftentimes is privates are private. My son has a tendency to want to moon people. I don't know why. He is his mother's son. No, just kidding. It's just what boys do, right? Boys are fascinated with their body parts. That's fine. That's curious. That's a healthy curiosity. I think when they're young children, 5 and 6 and younger, I think the way you react to their body parts is important. If you get real uncomfortable, then that can sometimes come across as shame. I was listening to a book by John Eldredge called Wild at Heart on the way here. I read it years ago in high school and just decided to kind of reread or listen to it. And so one of the things that he talked about was there's a movie, I forget, it's got Kevin Costner, where Kevin Costner kidnaps a young boy. It ends up being like a coming-of-age tale kind of thing. And the young boy is embarrassed. Kevin buys him a pair of pants he doesn't want to change in front of him. And the boy's embarrassed because his mother, somewhere along the way, or stepfather, said something negative regarding the size of his genitalia. And the kid is just overcome with this shame. And Kevin says, "No, man, that's a good size for a boy your age." And immediately the kid just goes, "Really? You mean it?" So the things that we say and how we say them have a really big impact, particularly when it comes to things that we don't generally feel super comfortable talking about. The most important thing I think you can do with your child at any age is to cultivate a relationship of conversation. So right now, privates are private. I had a talk with my daughter recently. She went with me a couple of weeks ago to a church, and I was getting the slides for the sex session, and I was getting those up to the guy in the booth, and had my computer up, and she saw them, and she said, "What's sex?" Oh, ask your mother. No, in that moment, with sound booth guy there, I was like, well, I also don't have time. This is, okay, well, not how I anticipated that. Well, we'll talk about it on the way home, okay? And she was satisfied with that, but she's never satisfied with it. She's the one that just she asks one question, there's 35 more coming in rapid succession. So she went to her class, I did the sessions, we were driving home, and I assumed she was immediately going to come back. She forgets nothing. She didn't bring it up. We got about halfway home, and the whole time I'm praying, I'm like, God, again, you can teach on something, but to be a doer is different, right? I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna go ahead and address it. And so I brought it back up and said, hey, you remember that question you asked me, about what is sex? She said, yeah. I said, okay, well, you know how mommy and daddy have told you that boys have parts and girls have parts, and you have brothers, yep. She said, penis, vagina. I said, yep, that's them. Mm-hmm. And I said, that's correct. When mommies and daddies get married, and they decide they want to have a baby and become a mommy and daddy, they have what's called sex, and it's where we use those body parts. Then they're joined together, and that helps create a baby that the mommy then grows in her tummy, and then the baby is born. She said, oh, okay. That's weird. Yeah, a little bit. You got any more questions? No? Okay. All right. Now, that's the first of many. But we've had a lot of conversations about body parts before we ever got to a conversation about sex. And that's probably more my wife's doing than mine. There's a ton of wisdom in that. I think that is a good place to begin. I'll let you know in 10 years where we end up, but right now, with a 9-year-old, that's how that first conversation came about. I asked her if she had ever heard that word at school, which I was really kind of surprised. I assumed that it would have come up by now, statistically speaking. So I think you start with body parts, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. God made boys, God made girls. As they start to get more curious, I think you answer the question. I don't think you necessarily go much farther than their question, because then that sometimes leads to other questions that they don't really grasp yet. When it comes to biblical things, I talk to my kids about things that are at their level and a little bit beyond, because I want them to hear it. I'll put it this way. You hear a lot of language before you can actually speak the language. And you can speak conversations before you can grammatically write out a correct sentence, right? So it's kind of the same thing with spiritual things. I want them to hear them, even if it doesn't click just yet, so that when it does, they've had it for a long time and it makes more sense. So hopefully that makes sense, some sense there. If you have a teenager and you've never talked with them about it, that's a challenge. As much as you can avoid that, I would encourage you to do so. But men, if you have boys, men, we have to lead the way in that. We have to do it in a way that has confidence, and I think you frame it the way we talked about earlier, the biblical framework of what God has designed and why he has designed it that way, and that sex is not simply just about the act, and that's why cultivating lust is detrimental to us spiritually, because it tells us that, hey, God, I have this desire, and I don't really trust you to fulfill that, so I'm going to take matters in my own hands, and I have to find a way to fulfill that desire. That's what giving into lust communicates. So as they get older, you can start using those kinds of terms and talking about more intangible concepts. But as much as you can, make it conversations. The idea that there's the talk, I think, is really short-sighted and incomplete, because an 8-year-old has a very different understanding and a different set of questions than an 18-year-old. So I don't know if that's helpful. There's probably some more detail on that. There are books out there. I can't remember. We've got one at home. I meant to bring it. I cannot remember the name of it. I'll try to find that. It may actually be on that list, but I'll ask my wife and see. But there's some books out there. So read. Talk to each other. That's the other thing as parents. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, he puts forth 4 norms that he thinks will help change and curtail these things. And the whole point of this is that everybody has to adopt these norms as a basis and a foundation. The challenge with all of this is you parent differently than I do, and that's okay. But the moment you give your kid a device before I do, there's tension between us. Because now my kid wants, well, so-and-so got it. Like, well, okay, yeah, but you're not. So there is a level where we kind of all have to agree to the same thing, so to speak. But in that, he wants long-term sustainable change. And that's not going to be done simply by device management. That's going to be done by a shift in thinking. And I think the same is true for the sexual stuff as well. All of us need to be willing to have these conversations with our kids so the norm goes from an unhealthy curiosity to a healthy curiosity and a godly understanding. So I promise not to run away from the conversation if you promise not to run away from the conversation. All right, that's, even if you do, I still promise not to, but yes.
Would you have a recommendation of a curriculum to be taught for the youth classes?
You know, that's a really good question. I need to do more research on that. I don't have one right offhand that I know of that's excellent. Somebody else may have some experience with that, but it's a good question that I need to have an answer for, so I'll look into that. Yeah, no, that's excellent. Maybe it's one that we create, you know? Yes, sir.
So something that stood out to me is the age of exposure.
Yes.
The average age being, you said 7. A couple years ago, I saw it was 9, so it's just dropping.
Just keeps going, yeah.
So I've got a 4-year-old boy, almost 5. That puts me within a couple years, you know, an average. So that means there's people down below that, right?
Right.
Getting exposed. So how do we protect kids from that? I understand we can create an environment around them, but if you send them to school,
Mm-hmm.
their friends have a phone,
Yep.
you know, they hop on. So if we are having a conversation and we're trying to explain, you know, what is sex, but that's not necessarily preparing them to exposure to, you know, porn,
Right.
videos,
Yep.
stuff like that.
Yeah, so and I think it's very valid. I have learned that there are limits to my limitations. During COVID, our daughter was playing with her friend across the street. Great family. We're not on the same level, or we're not on the same page spiritually necessarily, but as far as parenting and goodness, very, very, very good family. Daughter's super sweet. We heard them playing, and then we heard a voice we'd never heard before. Well, their daughter was on a tablet. She was in the online academy for school that during the chaos there of COVID, and she was talking to a classmate in her house who we didn't know. We kind of had a rule was we need to know who you're hanging out with. She was hanging out with her friend who then was also hanging out with us, and we were like, oh, that happened very quickly, that access to someone that we didn't know outside of our control. And that's where I realized, okay, there's a limit then to the limitations even that I put in, even if I put in all the effort. And I struggle as a parent. I want my kids to be prepared to lose their innocence, but I don't want to be the one that takes their innocence. And that's the balance that we're trying to.
When you're
Yep.
talking about a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old,
Yep.
you know, how much innocence am I taking away in preparation,
Right.
versus what am I stealing from them
I think
out
you-
of my own fear?
I think your goal is to make sure that you solidify the fact that you are an authority in their life for these kinds of questions. And that, I think, is cultivated by saying things like, if you hear a word, this is where we are right now, especially with our 5-year-old or 7-year-old, he's in 1st grade. So if you hear a word at school that you don't know, you've never heard it before, you come to us with it, there is 0 consequence. If it's a horrible word, you don't get in trouble for saying it. You ask us, and I promise you I'll always be honest with you. Now, if we identify it as a bad word and then you use it, you know, knowingly in the future, then maybe there's a consequence for that. But there's 0 consequence for you to come to us with questions. And that's, again, trying to cultivate the curiosity, coming to mom and dad as an authority. Because the moment they have any kind of access to anything else that's an authority, we got tension. I don't have hard data for this, but I believe that what you learn first, you learn the deepest. So it's harder to unteach something than it is to teach the first time. And so when it comes to body curiosity, that's why I think talking about body parts at 4, 5, and 6 years old is not a bad thing at all. I think it's a very good thing to identify the differences between the two genders. And I think to start saying things that God had a different design for men and for women and that kind of thing. And then as they get into that 1st and 2nd grade, I think the reality is we can't prevent everything. But I think if they're exposed to something, again, for me, I can tell you it was a Penthouse magazine, 5th grade. Justin Wilborn brought it to school. Like that, I don't think I'll ever forget that. It's etched in there, right? And that was 10 then, probably in 5th grade. So that was a few years ago now. I assume that younger, most likely, even if they're exposed to something, they don't know exactly what they saw. They don't know how to process something like that at that age. So if you see a change in behavior, asking questions is good. You should know your kid better than anybody, right? That's part of what I've discovered as a parent as I've gotten older and had more kids is my job is not just to tell my kids what to do, but it's to learn my children. So those are the other things. When they become more disconnected or you start to see some trends in class, there's a good chance there may be some guilt or shame that's in there that they don't really know how to process. And so then you can better equip them in that area. You can be better equipped, I guess, to ask questions, to get them to open up about those things. Tossing ball with them is a good way to get their mind occupied on something physical. And it's amazing how like that kind of opens up the dam for the emotional just to come out, you know. I mean, it'll hit you randomly. They'll talk about, hey, so, you know, something they felt guilty about out of nowhere. You're like, where did that come from? But in the moment, you don't tell your face that you're shocked. You tell, oh, really, buddy? Okay. So you don't react in shock or horror. Don't react to them. Eye contact, love them, you know, and I think those interactions are really important. If someone comes down in front to confess sin and they say that they've had an affair, well, I mean, that's not what we're going to do, right? Because that's even more like, that's a really fragile, vulnerable place to be in. So I'm not saying we don't address the sin, but if they're willingly coming and confessing that, then we don't really have to worry about our part of putting guilt on them. They're already feeling the brunt of that. And kids too, a lot of times they'll feel guilty for stuff that they don't know they shouldn't feel guilty for, but that's the only emotion that they feel, and they can't articulate that. That's the challenge. So trying to learn their emotional vocabulary is really helpful. And I think looking for those signs may yield a little bit more opportunity for you to, anything going on at school? You know, tell me about your day and, you know, that kind of stuff. Try not to ask yes or no questions. Try to ask open-ended to give them the freedom to do that. So, yeah, absolutely. Somebody else had their hand back here? Yes.
I think just kind of what Walt was talking about too, like I read an article a couple of years ago, and my kids are 13 and 10. So you know, it's like someone else, that they didn't have access in our house or from us,
Right.
but that someone's going to show them, or they're going to be somewhere else, or another kid has a device or whatever. So it was about teaching your kid how to respond to that. Like instead of them just being in shock or not knowing what to do with the whole, well, now they've seen it, you know, what do you do? Teach them whether it's to tell them a joke, make it sound funny, like, oh, dude, I can't even, you know,
Yeah.
whatever it is, teaching them how to respond, to turn away from it and not be glued into it, but also not be embarrassed or feel like everybody's going to think I'm not cool or whatever.
Yeah.
But teaching your kids and having the conversations about
That's really
there
good.
are other people who are going to look at things and see things that we don't think are appropriate, that
Yep.
we know God doesn't want us to be involved with, but teaching them how to respond to it because
That's
they're
really good.
always going to be exposed to it.
John Acuff is he's a really good follow on Instagram as well. I don't spend all my time on Instagram, but when I do, it's mostly these places. John Acuff, he's written several books. He's a really funny millennial, so he's my kind of guy. He had a post the other day where he talked about that very concept with his teenage daughters. He said that we gave them an out, and it was us. When they're at a party or they're in a social gathering and somebody wants to go do something that they know is not good, instead of them coming across as the shrewd, they say, well, let me text my parents. And they had it was, hey, Dad, let me ask your question. Let me ask your thoughts on this. Or so, it was some kind of like first sentence that gave John and his wife a heads up of they want the answer to be no, but they want it to be their parents' fault. He said, we'll take that bullet. You can blame it on us. Oh, actually, well, I asked, but my parents, they're lame. They're not going to let me. I know they're the worst. Like, that's fine. If it gives my kid the ability to say no to things confidently without losing some of that social equity, I'm willing to do that. And in time, they build up confidence then to just say no for their own convictions and stuff. But when you're 13 and 14, it's really hard. That social equity weighs heavy. So I think that's a great approach for the sexual stuff, but particularly for social side of things, to give them an out. Yes, sir.
I was going to make just a note of a book that I have not read, but that fits along with that. There's a book, you may know if it's good or bad, but it's called Good Pictures Bad.
Yes, that's the one I was thinking of.
Okay,
Yep.
and they have one for like ages 3 to 6.
Right, they've got different, yep.
Like a scaled up one for later.
Yep.
That's online. That's the folks I'd like to get.
My wife has read it and then said it was good. It was very helpful. So
Like
that's
a
one.
kid's book.
It's a kid's book, right? So it's illustrated and everything, and it's one that you can put it in your nighttime reading and age, gender appropriate as well. I would have different conversations with them, so they'll have different questions. So that's really good. Yep. Thank you for finding that one. Yes, ma'am.
Have you heard of God's design for sex?
I don't think so.
Okay, it kind of goes back to what Ms. Carroll was asking. It's not really curriculum, but it starts at age 3.
Okay.
It's a 4-series book, and our oldest is 7, and we haven't read it yet. We're planning on soon, but we've taught her like proper names for things. But,
Mm-hmm.
it's aimed for 3 to 5, so we plan to read her that one. But there's 4 series, and it goes all the way up to like late teen, young adult. But it goes through, God's design, what sex is, what it's
Mhm.
intended to be. It's more of a parent thing.
Yeah.
I think, 'cause we haven't gotten a second look yet. But obviously, our 4-year-old would be way too immature for something like
Yeah.
this. And the kids have different maturity levels. And
Right.
You just kind of decide when you talk to them. But,
Yeah.
a girl who was here earlier, I guess she's not here anymore. She has read it. Her daughter's 8, and I think she's read the first 2 books in hers.
Okay.
And I know that worked really well with her.
Yeah. And I think reading
Now,
those.
I don't know, who wrote it.
Yeah.
I don't know the history behind it. But
Right.
she kind of, sent it to me. It's called God's Design for Sex, and it's a progression.
That's great. Do you guys have like a members Facebook page or some kind of a platform where things like this, if you come across a book, hey, this would be great. I actually have a book back there that is new to our children's library at Madison. I haven't read it yet. I wanted to bring it to read it. It's about devices that our folks that are over the children's library said, hey, we want to get your thoughts on this. Where you guys, if you come across something like that, hey, this was really helpful. This brought about a really good conversation. You said there was a members page or something private that it would be really good to make sure that we're exchanging those ideas and those help. Because I've done a lot of reading and research, but I've got a 9-year-old. That's the oldest. So those of you that are parents of teens have a lot more experience than I do with that demographic. So we want to make sure that we're exchanging those ideas, make sure that you're talking to each other when you find a resource that you find helpful, especially with this kind of stuff, because it's difficult and every kid's different. So I think that's great. I wrote it down. I'll be looking for that one. I learn something new every time we do these. Yes, sir.
Sure, another question. For your 9-year-old, I guess, at what age and how do you go about giving a child a device? Because, we want to keep them from devices, but at the same time, we want to maintain communication.
Right. Yeah.
As technologies increase, our communities have gotten larger,
Mm-hmm.
potential for danger is a little bit higher.
Yep.
So, how are we navigating that? How would you
Yep.
suggest?
So it's a little bit in contrast to what I said earlier, using the example of human trafficking. But if you look at the data, we actually live in the safest time ever from like a criminology standpoint. And that's part of this dichotomy is that our children are safer in person than they ever have been, but more in danger online than they ever have been. The gentleman I referenced earlier, the kid was trafficked because of being online. It didn't happen without that connection. So our kids, we're very, very blessed where we live. We're in a neighborhood where we have a family that's kind of catty corner to our house. They have kids that are almost the same incremental ages. They have 3, and they moved in shortly after we did. Our kids have the closest thing that I know of to a 90s childhood. They go to their backyard to jump on the trampoline. They come to our backyard for the swing set and play set and baseball and stuff. I think there is less physical danger than we realize. I think the physical danger gets amplified because of technology. And so I try to let that kind of guide what I'm doing. When it comes to devices, I would say incremental. So a lot of families that I've seen will give their 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old a watch. So they can text their parents or a finite number of numbers. It's a communication device. It's not a connection networking device. There is a phone, pardon me. We'll go over a few more of these in the last session tomorrow as well, but it's called a Gab phone, which is just a phone, just a dumb phone. Flip phones have become more and more popular again that just are telephones. And so I think you can incrementally start giving them some, as they get older, and let's say they're going to be at practice and you need to know if practice is canceled. I think it's also okay for them to use the friend's phone from time to time or the teacher's phone. There are very few instances in our life, right, in our world, where our kids are truly independent from us and need to have a tether of some sort. So some of that, I think, examine your world, and you can make some adjustments there that maybe more accurately reflect your values. So if they're out playing in the yard, they don't need a phone. If they're playing even in the neighborhood at our neighbor's house, I call my neighbor, and, unless usually I can put eyes on them anyway. But I would start with something like that, something that is not connected to the world; it's connected to me only. But my recommendation is as late as you can. The Surgeon General says 16 for smart devices and social media. That doesn't sound unreasonable to me. I think that the damage is greater, potential for damage is greater if they have it earlier. And just my personal conviction, I just don't want them to I don't want them to get in the habit of this. And it kind of builds in some of those negative things that are difficult to overcome. And so I want to delay that as much as possible. I know we're not going to prevent it. I know we're not going to escape it. But I want to delay it as long as possible. But they're less than, I would say, not so much a number in age, but the maturity of your child. You know your child, and you can give them incremental access. You can give them a trial, that kind of thing. But the wearables, as far as watches, it lets them be kind of cool without having access to everything. And that's the biggest thing. And then watch their behavior. If you start to see that they're constantly looking, if it just connects to you, probably not going to be in danger of them, over communicating. Would be my experience there. But watch their behaviors, and always, always reserve the right to modify. Because I'm giving you this, even if it's a phone, it doesn't mean that it's yours forever. And as long as you're in my house, it is my device. I paid for it. Even if you pay for it, you're in my. I establish that early and often, not in like this overly authoritarian, but always come back. It's kind of like discipline, and my aim in discipline is if I'm going to spank my child, it's always going to be followed with a hug. And it's always going to be because this is truly the last resort of something that will connect with them. And if people have different approaches to spanking, that's fine. But I want it to communicate something very specific. And I want it to always come back to me. I had a friend who spanked his kid in front of me years and years ago, and it blew my mind because the immediate response of that child, without the dad's prompting, was to climb up in his lap and throw his arms around him. I thought, well, that's not the first time this has happened. It comes with not anger and rage, but it comes with, this is why this is harming our relationship or your safety or whatever. It comes with explanation. The why is really important. The why is the part that we usually miss. So whatever kind of discipline or restriction that we give our kids, we have to get better at explaining the why. And I think that satisfies the curiosity to where they're not going and looking everywhere else for the kid. It doesn't mean they always like it. I'm not trying to paint an unrealistic picture. But I think that it contributes there. So I would start incrementally with non-networked devices. And then from there you can, once you see that pattern back, reward them for the pattern and point them to this was a wise decision. And then point them to that this was unwise and this is why we're pulling back. And so it's just like a car. The keys get taken away if you do something, irresponsible. So you can always pull back. But once they leave the house, they're on their own. So you're trying to instill healthy consequences and the why. Any other thoughts or questions or better answers? All right. 6 minutes to spare. Something like that. That's all that I have for today. Tomorrow we'll have an adult Bible class here in the auditorium, and we're going to talk about the generation gap. To me, it's a really interesting study. It shows how all ages are more connected to these topics than we realize sometimes, and Satan tends to use the age gap to leverage us with disunity, and I think that's a disservice to the church. So we're going to examine that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of these analog consequences to the digital choices that we've made and go into a little bit more in depth on some of the research. And then we'll have a few more tools and resources to talk about tomorrow afternoon in the third session. So I hope you'll be able to join us. Let's close with a prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for the blessings you've given to us today to be together, to have fellowship, to examine the impact that we have on younger generations, the responsibility we have, and the resources that you have given to us to be successful and to thrive spiritually in this age. We thank you for allowing us to be alive now, to be a part of your kingdom and to wear your name. Help us to steward technology in a way that glorifies you and grows your kingdom. Help us to do that more effectively and more wisely every single day. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.